Hi everybody. We're going to try to do a quick overview of prompts and thesis statements for the essay portion of the AP exam so that we can talk about it in class and get some practice time in. So the second part of the AP exam, after you finish your multiple choice and short answer section, will require you to write two different essays. One uses documents. It's called the DBQ, the document-based question, and you'll base your essay on those documents. And the other is the long essay question, and all of the information for that essay will come from your brain. In the general format, and many of the requirements of these essays are the same. So especially the prompt and thesis statement work that we're going to be doing will help you for both of these essays. In general, some things you want to make sure to be doing in your historical writing are first, write in the past tense. History's over, so try to make sure that you're writing as if it's already done. Work on avoiding first and second person in your writing. You don't want to be using I, me, we, us, you. If you find yourself saying I think, cut that off of the start of your sentence and start with the words following think. When you're talking about people, remember you are not friends with these people, so you can't call them by your first name. George Washington isn't George to you. The first time that you mention a historical figure, use their full name, and then after that you can refer to them by their last name only. That's their surname. Some more tips. Make sure you're watching your capitalization. All proper nouns should be capitalized. America, American, always capitalized, never lowercase. Laws are always capitalized. If you're unsure, you can check with me, but all proper nouns should be capitalized. We'll talk more about data and how to use data in class, but when you're talking about a graph or a table, you should definitely be incorporating numbers into your writing as evidence. Try to avoid connecting your topic to the present day, things like the world would be very different today if not for such and such. That's just really not something that they're looking for in these essays. It doesn't help you to make your argument. And then one other thing to do is avoid using pronouns like they or them. A lot of times I find that students will use those words repeatedly in a sentence or in a paragraph, and it can get confusing about who they're referring to if multiple groups are mentioned in the paragraph. So watch your use of pronouns to make sure that you're being specific to keep your writing clear. When you get to the essay portion of the test, you're going to have a few steps that you want to follow, whether it's the DBQ or the long essay question. So the first thing that you'll want to do is take a careful look at the prompt itself. All of the prompts, whether it's for the DBQ or the LEQ, have one thing in common, and that is that they demand you to make a judgment about a historical situation, and you're going to use evidence to back up the judgment that you make. So most of the prompts that you'll see, no matter what historical skill they ask you about, most of them will begin with the phrase, evaluate the extent to which. And when you see that phrase, you should automatically replace it in your mind with judge how much. An evaluation is a judgment, and when you think about the extent of something, you're thinking about how big it is or how much of an impact it had. So that phrasing itself is setting you up to make a judgment if you're answering the question correctly. When you get the prompt, there's a few things that you want to do to pick it apart. So you'll first identify the main subject of the prompt, the overall topic that they're asking about. Then take a careful look at the date range that they are asking you about. So they'll usually give you a beginning and an end date for the question, and you need to write about the time period within that question. If you go on either side of that, if you go outside of the bounds of the date range, they don't count that as evidence for your answer. It might count for another piece of the rubric that we'll talk about later, but you want to confine your answer as much as possible to the date range that they provide. And they pick the beginning and end date specifically for a reason. So if you see 1865 in a prompt, your brain should automatically say, okay, the Civil War ended in 1865. So you should try to attach events to the beginning and end dates of the date range, because that might give you hints about what you should be thinking about. Make sure to identify all of the parts of the question, and I'll show you an example of this in a second, because you want to make sure to address everything that they're asking you about. And then finally, you'll want to consider the historical thinking skill that they're asking you about. We won't worry too much about that right now. We'll build up to that over the next couple of months. But causation, comparison, and continuity and change are the skills that the College Board will be expecting you to be able to demonstrate. So here's an example prompt on the left for you. And then I just included the 4 steps for breaking down the prompt on the right. And so the prompt is, evaluate the relative importance of domestic and foreign affairs in shaping American politics in the 1790s. So the first thing I need to do is identify the main subject of the prompt. What is it they're asking me to write about? And what they're really asking me to write about is American politics. So they want me to be thinking about the political situation. The date range that they've given me for step 2, they gave me a decade. They gave me the 1790s. So I'm thinking about American politics in this decade of the 1790s. And then when you consider identifying all parts of the question, you have to look at this question carefully, because it says domestic and foreign affairs in shaping American politics. So you have to make sure that you write about both of those areas. You'll have to write about domestic affairs, and you'll also have to write about foreign affairs. If you don't write about both, that will be a problem for you in earning points on your essay. The last part of breaking down this prompt, identify the historical thinking skill. The thinking skill for this question is causation. So you're looking at domestic and foreign affairs and how they had an impact on American politics. But we'll work more on that later, like I said before. After you break down the prompt, you need to take some time to brainstorm. And yes, your essays are timed. You have a limited time to write, but I really encourage you to take 5 minutes to plan, to just write down everything you know about the topic as specifically as you can. This is where you'll use vocabulary from class, our words of the week, proper nouns, so people, laws, events, other vocabulary that we've come across. Those are the things that should be in your brainstorm. And then you'll try to group those together. You'll look for similar pieces of information, group them into categories, and then those become the pieces of your thesis statement, which then become the topics of each of your body paragraphs. If you don't take time to plan at the start, you run the risk of getting halfway through your essay and realizing you're not writing about what you really want to write about. So take some time to brainstorm. I promise it will be worth it in the end. After you've done your brainstorm, then you'll work on writing your thesis statement, which is maybe the most important single piece of your entire essay. All essays have to contain a thesis statement, and the best place for that thesis statement is at the end of your introduction. It won't be at the very start of your essay. We'll talk more about what goes at the start first, but you want this thesis statement to come right at the tail end of your introductory paragraph. This is your claim. It's what you're claiming is true and what the content of your body paragraphs will prove to be true based on the evidence that you provide, based on the specifics that you came up with in your brainstorm. All of those go in your body paragraph. So things to avoid in your thesis statement. Don't just restate or rephrase the prompt. You need to go deeper than that, and we'll look at some examples so that you can see what it means to go deeper. Do not write more than 3 consecutive sentences for your thesis statement. The thesis statement is complex. We'll see a couple of different formulas you can use in a minute. So you can see it's not just going to be 1 sentence, but you don't want to make it too long either. Avoid being too general in your thesis statement. Things like there were social, political, and economic effects. Readers will not like that. They want you to have a little bit more depth in the claim that you're making in your thesis statement beyond these really general categories that you might get from historical themes. But you also, on the other hand, want to avoid being too specific. So vocabulary words should not be appearing in your thesis statement. Those are evidence in your body paragraphs. You want to hold on to those specific sorts of things to prove the thesis statement that you're making. And we'll continue to work on that. So here is an example of a prompt for you. Evaluate the extent to which the women's rights movement of the 1890s to 1920s was similar to the women's rights movement of the 1960s to 1980s. Here is an example for you of what rephrasing or restating the prompt looks like. And this example would not earn the point that you can get for the thesis statement in the rubric that the College Board uses for scoring. So if you wrote, the women's rights movement of the 1890s to 1920s had many similarities and differences with the women's rights movement of the 1960s to 1980s, all you've done is restated what they told you in the prompt. They told you that there's going to be some similarities and differences in the way they set up the prompt. So all you've done is said, yeah, College Board, you're right. There are many similarities and many differences. You have to make a comment about what those similarities and differences are all about in your thesis statement. So let's look at how you can do that. When you're attacking your thesis statement, I want you to try to use one of these two formulas here, and we'll try to get some practice with this in class tomorrow especially. So a big thesis statement formula that you can use is X, however, A and B, therefore Y. In this thesis statement formula, you can see the breakdown of what the letters stand for there. X is the counter argument or the concession statement. So you're starting with something where you're admitting to the other side, yeah, I concede that this is true. However, A, and then you'll give your first organizational category for something that you believe is more important than what you said in X, the counter argument. You'll have a second thing that you also think is more important. That's B, the second organizational category, that's more important than that counter argument or more impactful than that counter argument. And then Y, your answer in regard to the prompt. What's the claim that you're making? You can, and I'll show you some examples that I think will help you with this. An alternative formula is that you can use to set up your thesis statement is although X, A and B, therefore Y. So in that structure, you're saying, although X is true, A and B are actually more important. Therefore, Y is my argument. So let's look at an example of that using that prompt about the women's rights movements, comparing those two women's rights movements in the 20th century. So this formula, this thesis statement uses that first formula, and you can see that I've used colors to try to point out to you the X, the A, the B, and the Y. Women in the early and mid 20th century both sought to increase women's political power. So I'm conceding the other point of view there when I say both sought to increase women's political power. However, my argument is going to be the women's rights movement of the 1960s to 1980s expanded the fight for women's rights to consider gender roles in the home and economic inequality in the workplace. So you can see that gender roles in the home is going to be a topic that I write about in my essay, and I'll also write about economic inequality in the workplace in my essay. And those two things lead to my why, the claim that I'm making to answer the prompt. Therefore, despite some similar concerns, the women's movements of the 20th century were quite different. The prompt was asking me, how similar were they? And my answer is, they're really quite different. They do have this one similarity about increased political power, but the gender roles in the home and economic inequality stuff makes them very different. And you can see that breakdown here. This might, if you want to look at this another way, rather than with the color coding, you can see what X, A, B, and Y equal on this slide. And if you want to take a minute to look at that, if that's helpful, you can pause the video. With the same prompt, I took the alternative formula and wrote another thesis statement so that you can see that you can attack these prompts in a whole variety of ways. So this formula again is X is true, but A and B, therefore Y. So here's how, although X is true. So although the women's rights movements of the 1890s to 1920s and 1960s to 1980s had similar goals in terms of equality, they differed in terms of their strategies and levels of success. Therefore, the women's rights movements of the 20th century were vastly different. I think I forgot to write although in front of the X in that formula, if you notice up there. But the thesis statement itself looks good. So I'm conceding that they had similar goals in terms of equality. There, you can see that in red. That's my counter argument, and I'll have a paragraph about that in the body of my essay. But I'm saying that these movements differed in terms of their strategies. That's my A. I'll have another body paragraph about that. And they differed in terms of levels of success. That's my B, so I'll have a body paragraph about that. And then my overall claim, my overall answer to the question is that these movements were vastly different. So my strategies and levels of success paragraphs will build to show that they were vastly different. If you set up your thesis statement with either of these two formulas, you're really setting up your essay to do a lot of good things that we'll learn more about as we talk about the larger structure of our long essay questions. So you want to have this concession to the other point of view to help you set up a strong essay. Here again, if it helps you, you can see the breakdown of that alternative formula in another way without the color coding. And again, you can see I messed up and didn't put although in the alternative formula. But we can talk about that more tomorrow in class, and you can pause this if you want to take a look at it more. So the last thing I just want to end with is I've told you that the thesis statement will be at the end of your introduction. So if the thesis statement comes at the end of your introduction, how are you supposed to even start your essay? And the way you'll start your essay is by doing something called contextualizing. And we'll talk a lot more about that later, so you don't need to worry too much right now about what would be the very first sentence of your essay. The thesis statement is the most important piece, and we'll talk more about contextualization later. See you in class.